So Eisenhower's appeal to both the Republican and Democratic Party lay mostly in his military background in context of the Cold War. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about for the rest of this podcast is about Eisenhower's foreign policy. In 1952, the United States tests the hydrogen bomb for the first time. The hydrogen bomb was even more deadly and dangerous than the atomic bomb. And unlike with the atomic bomb, where it took the Soviets 4 years to develop their own version, the Soviets developed the same technology within a year. At this same time, both the Soviets and the United States have been increasingly developing long-range bombers. So this meant when Eisenhower was elected into office and began his term as president, that the Soviets and the Americans had reached a stage that we call mutually assured destruction. So, in other words, because of the proliferation of nuclear weapons and new weapons like the hydrogen bomb, because of the development of long range bombers, this meant that if the United States should launch a bomb against the Soviet Union would have time to respond by launching their own bomb, and we would both end up obliterated in a nuclear holocaust. So this meant that Eisenhower had to navigate a very delicate foreign policy situation. Now, delicate does not exactly describe his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Dulles was a lot more antagonistic than Eisenhower, and Dulles relished the potential use of American atomic power. Dulles embraced a policy known as massive retaliation, in which any attack, not only on the United States but on one of our allies, would result in the US deploying nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union. And by any attack, I mean anything, not just a nuclear attack, that we would be willing to respond with nuclear weapons to any kind of attack against the United States or our allies. That's what we call nuclear brinkmanship. And Dulles's very public expression of this antagonistic policy, along with the reality that when Eisenhower first came into office, there were only 1,000 nuclear warheads, but by 1960, there were 18,000 nuclear warheads in the world, led to widespread fear in the American populace of a potential nuclear war. In the 1950s, a lot of people start building bomb shelters in their backyards. Children participate in duck and cover drills at their schools where they are told to get underneath their desks in the event of a nuclear attack. The desks would not actually help them survive the nuclear holocaust, but if there was any if they were not incinerated, would actually just make it easier for authorities to locate their bodies. Okay, but it was meant to give school children some sense of peace and like they were doing something to try to save themselves. Now, Eisenhower was not as aggressive as Dulles. He saw the wisdom in trying to dial down the rhetoric. And in fact, the idea of dialing back the rhetoric of the Cold War became more possible in 1953 for two reasons. Number one, the Korean War ended in a stalemate, right? A declaration of truce and ceasefire. And in the same year, in 1953, Joseph Stalin died. So now the Soviet Union has a new leader. There is initially a little bit of jockeying for power, trying to figure out who will succeed. Stalin, if you're interested in black comedies that talk about Soviet history, I highly recommend the movie Death of Stalin, which talks about this and is actually accurate, other than a compressed timeline in the movie. In the end, Nikita Khrushchev will come out on top. Khrushchev becomes the new leader of the Soviet Union. He will meet with Eisenhower, and what gives Eisenhower hope that a better, more peaceful relationship with the Soviet Union and Khrushchev is possible is that Khrushchev publicly revealed and denounced Stalin's mass murders. In fact, Stalin had a higher body count in terms of people he had killed in the Soviet Union than Adolf Hitler did in Germany. So, initial signs were good that the United States and the Soviet Union could have a more peaceful relationship, but this unravels quickly. In 1956, an attempted anti-communist rebellion in Hungary is crushed by the Soviets. The rebels in Hungary appealed to Eisenhower for help, but Eisenhower said, look, it's in Eastern Europe, it's under the Soviet sphere of control, we're not getting involved in that. There was a ban on nuclear testing that was achieved between 1958 and 1961 after more and more people became aware of the negative health effects of nuclear bombs. Particularly, the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy takes the lead in raising these issues, but this ban on testing expires in 1961. What really wrecks the potential better relationship completely is when the Soviets shoot down an American U-2 plane flying over Soviet territory and are accused of espionage. And the Soviets accuse the United States of espionage. The United States is also wrestling with something that will complicate their very black and white understanding of the Cold War, and that's the phenomenon of decolonization. So, decolonization is the process in which a lot of these former colonies of places like Great Britain and France and Germany and others start to achieve independence after World War II. These decolonization movements sometimes are peaceful, sometimes we have wars of independence. And throughout Africa and Asia, where the decolonization movement is taking place, we do see a tendency to embrace more radical politics as these nations become independent. Many independence movements see socialism as a way to try to address and fix heavy dependence on foreign nations and imperial homelands. Many nations had used these colonies essentially just to get raw materials and had not really developed a full-fledged, well-rounded economy in these former colonies. And the United States, since the time of Woodrow Wilson, had committed to this idea of self-determination, that every people, every nation state should be allowed to choose their own form of government. But what do you do when the form of government that a nation wants to choose is communism? Because then the US support for self-determination immediately comes into conflict with the US policy of containment or stopping the spread of communism. And the United States, when faced with this dilemma, do we allow a nation to self-determine and choose communism, or do we block the expansion of communism, always chooses containment. Now, even though the United States and the Soviet Union pushed the Cold War as you're either with us or against us, most of these newly decolonized nations wanted to maintain neutrality, or what they called non-alignment. And we see this at meetings like the Bandung Conference in 1955, a meeting of African and Asian nations in Indonesia, to discuss cooperation between these newly independent nations and to potentially form an alternate neutral bloc of nations that could be an alternative to both the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, the United States was not afraid to get involved in a lot of these independence movements throughout the world. And they oftentimes got involved to shift what they saw as a dangerous flirtation with communism or leftist radical politics that could lead to communism. This is where we start to get the United States policy of regime change. The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, get involved in places like Guatemala and Iran during Eisenhower's time in office. In both Guatemala and Iran, their nations had nationalist leaders who weren't communist, but did want to wean their countries off of economic dependence on outside nations and the control of outside nations through trade. In Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman wanted land reform specifically to address the poverty of the working class. This idea of land reform threatened a U.S. company called United Fruit Company. And so the CIA supported the overthrow of Arbenz Guzman in 1953. By the way, United Fruit Company still exists. After the Cold War, they changed their name to shake off this association with regime change in Guatemala. You can today still buy Chiquita bananas at your local grocery store. In Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company as a way to get rid of outside control of oil, one of the most valuable commodities in Iran. He was ousted in 1954, again by a CIA-backed coup, and the United States installed the Shah in his place, which will later come back to bite us in the butt in the 1970s, which we'll talk about in a future class. Now, what the CIA was doing in places like Guatemala and Iran did not become public knowledge until the 1970s, and the fallout of the attempted impeachment and resignation of Richard Nixon. The Church Committee conducted a lot of investigations and found that both the FBI and the CIA had been used by presidents of both political parties since the 1950s in ways that did not have congressional oversight and approval. Okay, so this is not public knowledge in the 1950s, what is happening overseas with the CIA. What is the more public face of foreign relations is the Eisenhower Doctrine. Particularly in the Middle East, there's a concern over Egypt. Egypt at this time period is led by Abdel Nasser, who envisioned the unification of all Arab peoples across the Middle East. And in 1956, Nasser had seized control of the Suez Canal, which had been originally built by the French, connecting the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean. And Nasser declares it to be the sole possession of Egypt, which prompts an invasion by British, French, and Israeli troops to liberate the canal and return it back to international control. And none of those groups bother to inform or involve the United States, which is part of the reason why in the following year, 1957, Eisenhower issues what becomes known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, a pledge to defend allies in the Middle East who are fighting communism, okay, or homegrown, more leftist nationalism. Okay. And under this policy of the Eisenhower Doctrine, the United States sent troops into Lebanon in 1958 to prevent takeover by Egypt. It's also during Eisenhower's time in office that the U.S. escalates its involvement in Vietnam. Vietnam had been an independent nation following their own successful revolution for independence from Chinese colonialism hundreds of years ago. But in the 1800s, they became colonized by France. And the Vietnamese had long agitated for independence. As a young man, Ho Chi Minh, who will be the leader of this independence movement in Vietnam against the French, had actually gone to Paris during the Treaty of Versailles negotiations to end World War I to make an appeal on behalf of colonized people like Vietnam that they be allowed their independence in the wake of World War I, but he was rejected. Following World War II, the Vietnamese resume an armed struggle for independence from France. And between 1945 to 1954, the French are engaging in a war in Vietnam for control. Both Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower funneled billions of dollars of aid money to the French, effectively meaning the United States paid up to 80% of the cost of the war. But when France was clearly losing in 1954 and on the verge of defeat, Eisenhower refused to send in troops. This meant that in 1954, France negotiated a peace treaty called the Geneva Accords with Vietnam. So Vietnam in the Geneva Accords was given its independence. However, Vietnam was temporarily divided in half between North and South Vietnam until 1956. The plan was in 1956, elections would be held for the first unified government of Vietnam, and then Vietnam would fully achieve their independence as a unified nation. In the meantime, as of 1954, North Vietnam was controlled by Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam by Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a staunch anti-communist and had the support of the U.S. government. Ngo refused to hold elections in 1956 in violation of the Geneva Accords, and because Ngo refused to hold elections per the terms of the peace treaty, a guerrilla war started to break out against his control in South Vietnam. So at this point in time, the United States is involved in Vietnam, at least monetarily. What's going to escalate our military involvement there is going to be during John F. Kennedy's time in office, when we start sending in military advisors to help the South Vietnamese. The reason the United States got involved in what should have been a colonial independence dispute between France and Vietnam was again because of the fear that the Vietnamese might embrace communism. Although Ho Chi Minh was not initially a communist, he became more communist leaning towards the end of his political career. And by the time of Vietnamese victory in the war against the United States, Vietnam becomes pretty much solely communist.